Hey, everybody. Just wanted to give you a quick civil rights movement lecture. This is the beginnings of the civil rights, so it's not the entire civil rights movement, but just the events that kind of laid a foundation for what would become the very robust and visible civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. So we're going to basically look at the time period 1940 to 1960, although I'm going to acknowledge some things that were happening before that. All right, so between 1940 and 50, you start to see a lot of increased involvement in organizations like the NAACP. Membership in the NAACP is going to increase dramatically during this time period. You've got organized political groups that are going to lobby Congress to pass legislation to deal with the lynchings that are happening in the South. And what I mean by that is, so the Southern states obviously have the right to police their people and make the laws that they see fit for their state. And so there's groups now that are increasingly going to the federal government and asking them to get involved. You're going to see a variety of civil rights organizations. So this dates back to some of the origins or roots of the civil rights movement come in organizations that initially were concerned with labor issues. So there were some professions, in particular sleeping car porters, like butlers on fancy trains, who were predominantly, actually entirely black. They didn't pay wages. You were tipped if you did a good job, and that was how you made your income. And so they started to form labor unions and realized that a lot of their labor issues were different than other people's labor issues because they were black. They were being treated so much differently. And so a lot of those labor organizations, that one in particular, produced some of our earliest civil rights leaders in the early 20th century. You guys read last chapter, and a lot of you commented on the Double V campaign, right? So American soldiers now in direct combat, black soldiers in direct combat, coming home from World War II, realizing that they're facing the same kind of fascism they would argue that the Germans were facing with the Nazi regime. So Truman desegregates the army in this time period, and so we're starting to see some progress. So it's definitely becoming a front and center conversation in the United States, the issue of race and racism. Okay, and the court. So the Supreme Court of the United States has been weighing in on this since 1896. In 1896, in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court gave their blessing to a segregated society, said we could have a segregated society. But they did say if it was separate, it had to be equal. And that was a foot in the door for some really smart lawyers. Charles Hamilton Houston's the name that comes to mind, a soldier in World War I who comes back and commits his life to using the Plessy precedent to kind of crack the door open to ultimately destroy the Plessy precedent. So they go to court and they start to challenge segregation laws. Some, what they're going to see is they're going to have a lot of success with the ones that are directly related to education and segregation in education. Give you another idea of what was happening, though. Let's start at the top with Shelley versus Kramer. So Shelley versus Kramer is 1948, and the Shelley family wanted to buy a house, so they bought a house and they moved into a neighborhood, only to find out that all of the neighbors in that neighborhood, including the person who had sold the house to the Shelley family, had signed a covenant, a contract, created an agreement that they would not sell their homes to African American or Asian American families. Now, this is a contract between the people who lived in the neighborhood, and they argued it was legally binding. And they went to the state court, and the state court said, "You're right, it is legally binding, and so you cannot sell your house to the Shelley family because you have made a legal contract, a covenant to that promises not to sell to African American families, and Shelley's family isn't the Shelley family is an African American family." All right. The argument was that it's irrelevant whether it violates the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution because it is a private contract between private individuals. Well, the Shelley family takes it to the United States Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court turns that decision on its head and says, no, you cannot use state power to enforce a contract that is in direct violation of a constitutional amendment. So the Shelley versus Kramer case in 1948 is a big case in terms of the state can't be involved in these private acts of discrimination. And if you go to a court to try and enforce a contract that violates the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, you will find no help from the state. So in Shelley versus Kramer, it did not say that restrictive covenants were illegal, just unenforceable. right? And so that's a step forward. Then we have some education cases that predate Brown that kind of set the stage for Brown. And by the way, there was a lot of these, so I'm just giving you a couple examples. Sweat versus Painter and McLaurin versus Oklahoma State Regents, kind of sister cases in 1950. Sweat versus Painter was a guy who wanted to go to law school in Texas, lived in Texas, no law schools that would accept black applicants. They would not even look at their applications. McLaurin in Oklahoma got into a college, was accepted into a white college, but was segregated within that white college. You can see this picture here of what we mean. It's kind of crazy, right? He's got his desk sitting out just outside the classroom. He was not allowed to interact or intermingle with the white students. So these cases come to the Supreme Court. Now, in the Sweat versus Painter case, Texas had originally told Sweat, you know what, you can go to a different state if you want to go to law school. And that didn't seem to satisfy. So what they ultimately decided to do was create, I'm forgetting the name of it, but it was the University of Texas Law School for Negroes or something like that, right? And they created this shoddy little law school to say that, oh, well, we do have a separate law school for Mr. Sweat. But it was, nothing like University of Texas. And so the Supreme Court said, look, that is separate, but it's not equal. There's no law library. There's like a couple of professors that don't have the experience. There's not the same prestige as the University of Texas, so it is not equal. All right. McLaurin versus Oklahoma State Regents, the Supreme Court also said that making McLaurin sit outside of the classroom is inhibiting his education. And so it's not an equal education. Even though he's at the same facility, he can't be made to sit outside. And so these two cases kind of lay the foundation that give the civil rights movement the courage to finally, in 1954, challenge segregation in education, racial segregation in education, as inherently unequal, that there's no way you can make it equal. And they use a psychological argument, right? They say when you separate people, you are telling them that there is a reason they need to be separated. And if you're telling them there's a reason they need to be separated, they are going to learn something from that. And as we saw, black students were learning that they were inferior, that they weren't smart, that they weren't going to be successful. That was what society was telling them through this systematic segregation of racial groups in education. So in Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court said, yeah, that's right. And you don't separate equal groups, right? You don't separate equal groups. You separate unequal groups. So in 1954, the Supreme Court finally said separate but equal is inherently unequal, meaning there is nothing these states can do. They can, build the exact same building, use the exact same textbooks, but if they keep them separate, they're doing an injustice to the black students. And they're violating most importantly, to the legal reasoning, they're violating the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. All right. So that lays a legal foundation for the movement that begins immediately after, and it becomes a public movement. So we talked about Emmett Till earlier in the week. In 1955, was killed. This very public funeral that sparked and ignited people's anger across the country and across the world. And later in that year, in 1955, we saw the Montgomery bus boycott. So up in the upper right, you see Rosa Parks there, who worked as a secretary for NAACP, was prepared to do this, had talked about doing this, and finally one day says, you know what, I'm doing it. I'm going to integrate a bus. She gets arrested for trying to integrate a bus, and it leads to a boycott. And this becomes a very effective tool for the civil rights movement, is to boycott. Hit them where it hurts, they say. Hit them in the wallet. And the ridership of the Montgomery buses was predominantly black. And so the buses run empty. And eventually, after I think it was 11 months, 12 months of boycotting the buses, the Supreme Court of the United States says, look, you got to integrate the buses. You can't make some people sit in the back, some people sit in the front. All right. So that was the beginnings. That's kind of where, a lot of history books will point to for the beginnings of the civil rights movement. I hope you can see it was coming prior to the Montgomery bus boycott. But this is where, with the Montgomery bus boycott, Martin Luther King Jr. makes his name. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference coalesces, and we start to see the leaders that we usually associate with the civil rights movement on the national and international scene. Okay, this bottom picture, this is the Little Rock Nine. So there's a video on Canvas. It's linked to Canvas called the Little Rock Nine. I want you to watch that video. It's a telling of the story of the integration of Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. So pretty moderate town. They thought, you know what, we're going to move forward on this Brown versus Board of Education case, this decision, because schools aren't integrating. It's 3 years later, and our schools are still all white and all black. So we're going to take some top students from some of the black schools, and we're going to invite them to Central High School, and we're going to integrate. And the town and the state and the country responded immediately, right? And so the state of Arkansas, the governor, a guy by the name of Orville Faubus, you'll see him in the film, decides, you know what, I'm not having it. I'm going to use the National Guard. So he takes the National Guard armed state militia and surrounds the school to prevent the black students from coming in, allows only the white students in, right? In direct violation of the Brown versus Board of Education holding that black students can go to white schools, and the school board of Little Rock, Arkansas, who had told these kids that they would be enrolled at Central High School. All right, so the president of the United States at this time, Eisenhower, is hating the fact that this is becoming a confrontation, right? But that's what the civil rights movement is trying to do: make it a confrontation. Be confrontational, be peaceful, be nonviolent, but be confrontational. And so this Little Rock Nine in 1957, they try again the next day, and the president of the United States had talked to Orville Faubus, and Orville Faubus removes the National Guard, but there's a mob, right? And this angry mob, and you see this picture, this angry mob is going to prevent the students from getting into the high school. Once they get in, they'll kind of surround the buildings and start to storm it. There's talk about, you'll see this in the video, it's crazy stuff. But there's talk about, the kids are hearing some of the parents and officials talk about, well, what do we do? And maybe if we let one of the kids go out to the crowd and we give them one of them, we can get the other ones out of here. So it was an ugly situation. You can see that from this picture. This is Elizabeth Eckford in this picture. In the bottom, it's an iconic photo of this time period. And that's one of her peers behind her. So what I want you to do is I want you to watch the segment from Eyes on the Prize that I've linked to Canvas that is the telling of the story of the Little Rock Nine. I think there's no substitute for actually seeing it play out and hearing from the students who were involved in that. So if you get a chance, if you haven't already, take a look at that video. And yeah, I think we'll get a good sense of our launching off point for the 1960s. All right. Take care, everybody, and I hope to see you soon.